Hello, it's wonderful to imagine your lovely faces looking back at me. I hope you guys are all doing great, and I'm really excited to be moving forward with this class. So a couple things I want to say as we start out on our new online edition of Intergenerational Mobility. I want to start by talking a little bit about how the class is going to work moving forward, and then give a little bit of an introduction to today's material. So the first thing I want to say as we're moving forward is I know that as we're dealing with this situation, as we're dealing with this health crisis, you guys are undergoing a lot of stresses that you were not anticipating as you moved into this semester. And so my first hope for you guys is that you do what you can to make sure that you're personally staying safe, staying healthy, and staying as unstressed out as possible. So I know it's an incredibly stressful time for all of us. I know I haven't been able to keep my mind off of the news, but please put that first to make sure that you're taking care of yourselves. My goal for the rest of this semester is to deliver to you guys an educational experience as close as possible to what you would have gotten had we remained in person. I really hope that we can continue to deliver this material in a way that is interesting and useful and valuable for you. But it's also to make sure that this experience does not introduce more stress and anxiety and uncertainty in your lives. So with that being said, I really hope that you will stay in close communication with me about what's working and what isn't working as we go forward. I'm very happy to adjust how we go about this class in order to make sure that it is a good experience for everyone and that it acknowledges what you guys are dealing with. So I'm very happy to be flexible in every way that I can be flexible. Just make sure that you let me know. But one thing I wanted to say before we get to today's stuff, I want to lay out again what the plan is going to be moving forward, how we're going to deal with class material. So our class time is going to consist of a couple pieces. The first, which is just like what we did before, is to have you do each class period's readings and post a thought, reflection, question, opinion, etc. onto Moodle, just as we've done before. I'm also going to be posting videotaped lectures like the one that you're watching for each class period. So I'll break them up into chunks, post them on YouTube, and the hope is that you'll have a chance to watch these videotaped lectures prior to our simultaneous in-person meetings. Then during our normal class period, so from starting at 1:30 on Tuesdays and Thursdays, we're going to get together on BlueJeans in order to have the discussion part of the class take place. So we'll talk about our Moodle posts and we'll group together to talk more broadly about the material that we covered, just like we would do in class. One thing I want to point out is because many of you guys are going to have difficulties making it to the normal appointed class time, whether those difficulties are Wi-Fi related, time zone related, other general life stuff, it is not mandatory that you sign in on those BlueJeans meetings. One thing I would ask though is if you're not able to make it to those BlueJeans meetings, please post additional content onto Moodle, letting me know what you were unsure of, what you want clarification on, or what you thought, so that we can have as much as possible, we can continue with the sort of discussion-based class that we've been having. Okay, so does that all sound good? Hopefully that's going to be a plan that works as we move forward, but of course if it doesn't, for whatever reason, just let me know and we'll adjust from there. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about this paper by Eric Chin, looking at the effects of Chicago's public housing demolition on children who had been living in public housing projects. So just to outline where we're going a little bit, we're going to start by talking about the background of the Chicago public housing in particular, the demolition of that public housing, and the ways in which this experience differed from the experience of moving to opportunity participants. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the methodology of this paper, which is deceptively simple, but actually has a lot of interesting stuff going on behind the scenes. We'll talk through the results a little bit, and then I want to focus on one particular piece of analysis, which is how the fact that this is a non-voluntary experience influences the results. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is just talk very briefly about Chicago public housing. So this picture that we've got here, this kind of headline picture for the lecture, is of one of the housing towers of the Robert Taylor homes being demolished. So as we talked about before the break, a lot of public housing construction in the United States followed this housing tower model, right? So instead of building 1 or 2 or 3 story buildings, housing authorities built these large housing skyscrapers. And part of the reason for this was a belief at the time that this was kind of the modern, most luxurious and desirable way to live. Another part of it was that cities had a difficult time procuring space on which to build public housing and often faced a lot of local opposition for public housing projects. All of those forces were probably greater in Chicago than anywhere else. So one thing I want you to notice here, in addition to this picture, is that the public housing in Chicago is immensely, immensely concentrated. So if we look here at these black dots that we've got here are showing you the locations of family public housing. So you can see that while there's some kind of on the west side of Chicago, there's the Cabrini Green Project, which was one of the most famous projects in Chicago on the north side. A large fraction of this housing is concentrated in a belt on the south side near State Street. And so essentially what this means is that people who are living in these projects live in very, very close proximity to a large number of other people who are receiving public housing and have very few neighbors who are not receiving public housing. Again, to give you a visual of this is looking down the Dan Ryan Expressway, one of the big highways in Chicago, towards downtown Chicago. And you can see all of these buildings here, all of these high rises are public housing. So this is the Robert Taylor Homes, which was for a while not only the largest federal housing project in the United States, it was actually the largest housing project in the world, the largest public housing complex in the world, which is particularly compelling when you realize that this was during a period when the Soviet Union existed. So this is just an enormously concentrated group of housing projects. And I want you to notice that because of the fact that they're built right up along the railroad tracks and the highway, it means that these housing projects only really have neighbors on one side, right? So you've got this massive, massive, massive concentration of public housing with almost nothing else nearby. So as a result of that, poverty was much more concentrated for people living in Chicago public housing than for people who lived in public housing in other parts of the country. If we look at the Moving to Opportunity sample as an example, the average level of concentration of poverty for the control group in Moving to Opportunity was about 50%. So, just about here. In contrast, just about here, right? In contrast, if we look at the control group here, that is the people whose high-rise towers were not demolished in the early 1990s, we're going to see that the majority of them lived in neighborhoods that experienced more than 80% poverty rates, right? And the average poverty rate is going to be more like 65%. So what this means is that most children growing up in these neighborhoods know very, very few people who are not living in poverty, and also very few people who are not living in the projects. So just to give you a sense of what life was like in these projects, I've pulled a couple of excerpts from this pretty cool book called Our America, which was written by two 13-year-olds who grew up in the Ida B. Wells projects, which was nearby the Robert Taylor Homes that we were looking at. Okay, so the first excerpt is Lloyd talking about his sister, who says, "My older sister Janelle is 17 and lives in the same room right across from my grandma. She has a little 2-year-old boy named Jerry Marquise Jones, who we all call Mucky. Everybody in the house is worried about Janelle. She's been messing up a lot lately. Just like last week, she drank so much E&J that she almost died. They had to take her to the hospital. The way I see it, what's happening with Janelle is like what's happened to a lot of kids in the neighborhood. A lot of times the girl where people say, this is going to be the one that makes it, is the first one to have babies. Or the boy who's into his books all day, all he really wants is to be with it. So when he gets the opportunity, he's going to do all kinds of bad stuff." So the picture that they paint of living in these towers is one where there's lots and lots of kids and teenagers who, just by the nature of the challenges faced by adults in this situation, don't have a great deal of supervision and therefore get themselves and each other into a lot of trouble. This escalates to one of the most famous incidents that happened in the Ida B. Wells projects, and one of the incidents that in some ways precipitated the destruction of a lot of these projects, the demolition of a lot of these projects. Everybody in the hood heard the same story about how Eric Morse was murdered. The incident involved 4 kids, 2 victims, 5-year-old Eric Morse and his 8-year-old brother Derek, and 2 assailants, a 10-year-old named Johnny and an 11-year-old named Tyrone. Supposedly, Johnny and Tyrone tried to get Eric to steal candy for them from Jewel's supermarket. That's where all the shorties in the well steal from. Eric told his mother, Toni Morse, and she went and told Tyrone's mother. Tyrone got in trouble. Johnny and Tyrone decided to seek revenge on Eric and his brother. On Thursday, October 13th, Johnny and Tyrone saw Eric Morse and his older brother Derek outside one of the high-rises in Ida B's. Johnny and Tyrone asked Eric and Derek to come upstairs to look at their clubhouse, a vacant apartment on the 14th floor. The four shorties went upstairs and pulled off the boards covering the door to apartment 1405. When they got inside, Johnny and Tyrone grabbed Eric and held him out of a window. Derek ran down 14 flights of stairs to try to save his brother. He thought he could catch him before he hit the ground. Eric was pronounced dead 10 minutes later. So again, the story that this is painting is one where, there's lots and lots of kids that are out of control in their behavior that pose dangers to other kids, but also that the physical structure of this building leads itself to lots of dangers. So there's lots of vacant apartment buildings, right? The apartment 1405 that they're talking about is a vacant building with just a piece of plywood over the door that provides opportunities for people to engage in all sorts of criminal activity and for kids to get in trouble and get hurt. There's also a lack of physical safety. After this event took place, a lot of housing residents documented the fact that from almost every one of these high-rise towers, it's possible for a child to get up on the roof and be on a roof with no protection. So again, just to kind of illustrate this point, this is a picture of that particular apartment building, the apartment building where this took place. You can see it's protected by just a piece of plywood that's easily removed. So this is the sort of physical disrepair that these apartments, these high-rise towers were in at the point that the city decided to demolish them. So as a result of all of this, what happened was in the early 1990s, several of these high-rise apartments started to face maintenance issues that couldn't be deferred anymore. Things like water mains bursting, furnaces breaking, and the city of Chicago and the Chicago Housing Authority did not have the credibility at that point to be able to argue that they could repair these problems. People did not trust their management. And so this was seen as an opportunity to start just demolishing these high-rise housing projects and replacing them with mixed income and low-rise housing. So the idea was all of these people who had been living in these high-rise housing projects were going to instead move into new developments that had some market rate houses and some subsidized houses. We're going to receive Section 8 vouchers, and we're going to move into newly built housing on the original sites of these large-scale housing projects that were built for smaller numbers of people without interior corridors and other sorts of physical structures that led themselves to more crime and disorder. Now, it's really important to note that while the goal was that there would be this sort of mixed income housing constructed for everyone, the concern right off the bat that never was abated was that the Housing Authority really did not have a plan to build enough housing to house everybody. So while they gave everybody moving to opportunity vouchers, as we talked about before the break, there was pretty much from the moment that this happened, a shortage of housing that would accept moving to opportunity vouchers. So you would be given a voucher, told that your housing project was going to be demolished, and go in a desperate search for anyone that would take your voucher and allow you to move to a new location. And so as a result of this, when we talk about whether this is voluntary or non-voluntary, it's really pretty significant that it's not the case. You might say after hearing kind of scary stories about these housing projects that of course anyone would want to leave, but that's not necessarily the case. A lot of people were very resistant to leaving because of the fact that A, they had friends, they had family, they had a whole social life in a community, but B, the alternative housing arrangement for families that were being evicted from these housing projects was very up in the air. It was very much, our hope is that everyone is going to find new housing. So as we look at this project, at this paper, and compare it to moving to opportunity, there's a couple things that I want to highlight, kind of playing off of what we've just talked about. The first thing is that the poverty rates faced by families that were in these housing projects were much higher than the poverty rates faced by the control groups for moving to opportunity. Basically, Chicago public housing was just far more concentrated than anywhere else. Almost 2/3 poverty rates on average rather than 50%. And also that for the treatment group, for the people who had their housing demolished, they lived in higher poverty neighborhoods than did the Section 8 recipients or the Moving to Opportunity voucher recipients in the Moving to Opportunity experiment. The second thing is that whereas only about 25% of eligible households signed up for Moving to Opportunity, in this case, there was no signing up or not signing up, right? Your housing project was demolished, you had to leave. And then the last thing is, whereas in Moving to Opportunity, it was possible for kids or for parents to go back and visit the housing project that they lived in, right, to maintain a social connection with the old housing project. That's not possible when your housing project has been demolished. So just to highlight this last point, we saw what the we saw what these large housing projects looked like before they were demolished. This is what they look like today. You can see there's nothing here but a large grassy field. One last thing I want to point out, this is kind of maybe a little bit of an aside, but I'll go for it, is part of the reason that there's still nothing constructed on this site, despite the fact that it's been almost 2 decades since the large housing towers went down, is that for regulatory reasons, the Chicago Housing Authority has been unable to use any of this land and has been unwilling to sell any of this land. So again, this sort of promise that mixed income housing was going to be built for everyone has been only half fulfilled. There have been new mixed income housing developments. There have been people who use Section 8 vouchers, but to a large extent, the housing that had existed was replaced with nothing. And so when we look at these results and we see these large and positive results, remember that this comes from a very imperfect version of this policy of moving people out of highly concentrated high-rise housing projects.